Hey guys, Dusty back here with Blind-Droid Tech, and this is another new series I'm trying out. Let me know how you guys like it. But this series is a vlog series that a couple of you have suggested, so I'm going to go ahead and do my best to bring you guys what you want. So in this vlog, I'm just going to talk about the differences in processors and part configurations of Android versus iPhones. Because I know a lot of people talk about how Android lags and the lack of smoothness in the Android community or Android space. And I just wanted to put together this vlog kind of detailing some of these different phones that have different component configurations and all that. But first, I wanted to quickly talk about the differences between the Qualcomm Snapdragon processors, because not every phone has the exact same processor like in the iPhone. iPhone at this point has two main models, and then they have an SE version, which is the smaller version, but I believe it still has similar specs. And the iPhone 7 has 2 gigabytes of RAM, and the A10, I believe it's either A10 or A10 Fusion. And then the 7 Plus has 3 gigabytes of RAM on top of the A10 chip. So, in the Android space, Qualcomm dominates in processors in the United States, at least. Internationally, Huawei, Chinese company, makes their own in-house processor called the Kirin, and at this very moment they're at the Kirin 960, although the Mate 10, Huawei Mate 10 is said to be announced on the IFA International Trade Show in Berlin in, I believe it's starting August 30th or August 31st. They're going to unveil the new Mate, and they're claiming that they're bringing their new processor, which is going to be even faster than the Snapdragon 835, blah blah blah. But Huawei makes their own. Apple obviously has their own processors made for them specifically. And Samsung actually has their own in-house Exynos processor. At this very minute, they're on the 8895, which is very comparable to the Snapdragon 835. But there are three main versions of Qualcomm processors in different priced Android devices out there, and Qualcomm owns the U.S. market when it comes to processors. I believe they have something where they're the only ones. They made themselves the only ones allowed to put processors into devices that are sold in the United States. I'm not exactly sure what the reasoning. I'm sure it's all greed. They want to control the U.S. market processors. The U.S. market of phones with processors inside. And so there is the Snapdragon 800 series in what we call the flagship or high-end Android devices, such as this year the 835 is in the Sony Xperia XZ Premium with 4 gigabytes of RAM, 64 gigs of storage, micro SD card slot. The Galaxy S8 and S8 Plus have the Snapdragon 835 in the United States with 4 gigabytes of RAM, 64 gigs of storage. The HTC U11, same 64 gigabytes of memory, 4 gigs of RAM. There is an international version with 6 gigabytes of RAM and 128 gigabytes of storage with the 835 processor in it. Motorola has the new Z2 Force with the 835, 4 gigs of RAM, 64 gigs of storage. LG at this point with the G6 has last year's Snapdragon 821 processor with 4 gigs of RAM and 32 gigabytes of storage. There's a lot of controversy behind that, but basically when Samsung put its Galaxy S8 and S8 Plus into mass production, they soaked up all of the Snapdragon 835 chips available, and LG really wanted to release their next flagship with, or before anybody else was able to try and gather some market share. So that was an unfortunate decision on LG's part. Now, there's not a whole lot of difference between the 821 and the 835, but there is a noticeable difference in the LTE modem part of it. And again, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna leave the URL for the Qualcomm website that I checked to compare the different processors, so you guys can view it for yourselves. But the 835 has Category 16 LTE modem, which is up to a gigabit per second download and 150 megabits upload. The 821 is the 821 and 820, because the 821 is just a slightly modified version of the 820. They both have Category 12, up to 600 megabits per second download and up to 150 megabits upload. And then the 2 years ago, the 810 processor, or the Snapdragon 810, had a Category 10 with up to 450 megabits per second download and 50 megabits upload. And obviously the Snapdragon 835 is capable of the brand new Qualcomm Quick Charge 4.0, although no phones yet have taken advantage of the Quick Charge 4.0. Right now, all phones out are only advertised at Quick Charge 3.0, although with that processor being able to handle it, manufacturers might be able to put out a software update to enable that. But as of right now, Quick Charge 3.0 is the fastest Quick Charge available, and I mean, I honestly don't notice much of a difference. I guess it just really depends. I mean, the batteries aren't terribly much bigger than they were a couple years ago. Some manufacturers have put bigger batteries. Some have actually gotten a little smaller for fear of having any battery issues with the device. But the main difference between the processors is the LTE modem, the compatibility with the camera sensors. The 835 obviously has the highest compatibility with two sensors, the highest megapixel capabilities, and also single cameras. They have the highest. That processor has the highest compatibility with the highest megapixel camera possible. And then the 600 series processors are, and then my bad guys, and then the 800 processors. The 835 is a octa-core, but it's set up as two quad-cores, and they have ARM Cortex technology. They have two different technologies within each set of four. So one set of four is clocked at a higher up to 2.45 gigahertz. And then the lower set of four is set to up to 1.8 or 1.9. And then the 821 last year is also built on an octa-core architecture, set up as two quad-cores. And they also have two different ARM Cortex technologies. One is a higher, up to 2 gigahertz. That also might be up to 2.4 gigahertz depending on the manufacturer, and then the lower is between 1.6 and 1.9 gigahertz. And from my understanding, that's for efficiency. They don't want all 8 cores to be set at 2.45. Otherwise, that would drain the battery a little easier and a little quicker. And then the 600 processors is what's known as the mid-rangers. So phones such as the Moto G5 Plus and G5, and those are the ones that come to mind right off the top of my head. I know there's, and then the Moto Z Play, and then the new, this year, the Moto Z2 Play has the 626, I believe, which is just a slightly upgraded version of the 625 from last year, and the G4 and G4 Plus. And those are also, most of those are also octa-core. I saw a couple 600 series processors that were hexa-core. So most of them are 8 cores set up as 2 quad-core chipsets, or 2 quad-core architectures. And then the hexa-core is 2 chips at a higher and then 4 at a lower clock speed. And then the difference between the 800 series and the 600 series is all of the 800 series are capable of 4K playback, 4K video playback, and 4K recording, both on the front and on the back cameras. And then the 600 series, I think there's a couple capable of 4K, but most are set at 1080p. The processor can handle up to Quad HD. Both the 6 and 800 are capable of Quad HD. The 600 is capped at Quad HD, but there is actually the Xperia XZ Premium from Sony actually has a 4K that's actually downscaled to 1080p most of the time, unless you're in a Photos app, Sony Photos app, or Netflix with compatible 4K content. Same with Amazon Prime Video. There's said to be some 4K content available for that. And then most of the video recording and video playback are at 1080p. And then the processor speeds are slightly lower. The very max clock speed of the 600 series is about 2 gigahertz. And then that's the higher set of 4, and then the lower set of 4 is usually set about 1.6 to 1.8. And then the LTE modem is also slightly downgraded, so it looks like most of the 600s, at least the new 600 processors, are capable of up to 300 megabits per second, and then the download and 150 or 100 megabits upload. And then most of those do have Quick Charge 3.0 also. There's a couple older ones that are only capable of Quick Charge 2.0. And then the Snapdragon 400 series processor, which is called the low-end or budget devices, are also, some of those are octa-core and then some are quad-core. And those are also set up as 2 quad-core chip architectures. So one is up, the higher end is up, or the higher 4 is up to 1.8 or 1.9 gigahertz, and the lower is usually set at, the lower 4 is usually set between 1.4 and 1.6 gigahertz. And then most of those processors are capable of displays up to 1080p. Some of them actually have 720p displays because they're budget range devices, so they're between 0 and 150 to $200. Mid-range is between 2 and 500, and then the flagship is 500 or 500 and up. The only exception to that is the OnePlus 5. The OnePlus series has always been on the cheaper end because they're trying to undercut the competition, whereas they cut a few corners as well. So, and the OnePlus 5 really isn't even that far off from the $500. If you want the 6 gigabytes of RAM and 64 gigs of storage model, that's going to cost you $479. And then the 8 gigabytes of RAM and 128 gigabytes of storage is $540. So technically it is up there in the flagship price now. And so the 400 series, 600 series, and 800 series respectively has certain, low end disadvantages and high end advantages depending on what you want and need from your devices. And the 400 series, from my reading, is capable of up to about 150 megabits download and about 50 megabits upload or so for most of them. And I mean, even 150 megabits download and 50 megabits upload is good. The problem is the 800 series is capable of 4 carrier aggregation at 20 megahertz. So for companies like T-Mobile and AT&T, they've got 4. Well, right now T-Mobile's got 3 bands. They've got the 2, 4, and 12. So they've got 3 carrier aggregation. They've got band 66, but from my understanding, that's just a multi-band frequency for between, a couple different bands together. So I think technically that can be considered 4th carrier. And 4 carrier aggregation just means they can use all those different bands at once if they're all available in your area to increase your download speed and upload speed and also your connectivity to the network. Same with AT&T. I believe they've actually got 4 bands, and they have started rolling out the 4 carrier aggregation in areas where it's available, where all the bands are available. I'm going to go into detail about these carriers and their technology in a different video, because this video would be way too long. Last time I tried to include it all in the same video, and the video was upwards an hour, and I'm not going to punish you guys that much. So I've had to cut down on that to try and keep the video as short as possible, but still give you guys the most amount of information possible. And then the Snapdragon 821, the main difference, people are saying there's not much real life difference between the 821 and the 835. And in real world usage, that is true. But from my reading, and I mean, you guys can get mad at me if you want, if you think I'm wrong, but the Snapdragon or the Qualcomm website does specifically say that the 821 and the 820 are only capable of 3 carrier aggregation at 20 megahertz, and then the 810, which I don't think is available in any devices anymore because that's a couple of year old. That's only capable of 2 carrier aggregation, and then the 600 series is also set at a lower carrier aggregation at a lower megahertz bandwidth. So there is a difference between last year's processor and this year's when it comes to LTE modem. But if you're not terribly worried about that, I wouldn't be as worried about the download speed and upload speed, but I would be concerned with the carrier aggregation because that's going to keep you connected to the network a lot more than, let's say, a non-carrier aggregated phone. So, let's say T-Mobile in my area only has band 2 and band 4. So right now I'm on 2 carrier aggregation for that. And, my speeds are still pretty good, but they could be better if I had band 12. And then now they've got the 600 megahertz spectrum, which is band 71. That's coming to most areas eventually. They say it's going to take a couple years to fully roll it out. Even Verizon took years to, start fully opening their LTE spectrum, and they're still working on it. They're still not completely open. and they've actually been working on an all LTE network since I believe it was either 2014 or 2015. But that's the main difference between the different processors. And these budget phones usually come with between 1 and 2 gigabytes of RAM and 16 gigabytes of storage. Some of them do have a micro SD card slot for expandable memory, some don't. And then the mid range phones usually have 2 or 3 gigabytes of RAM. And the Moto G4 and G5 and G5 Plus and G4 Plus, they've actually had a model with 2 gigabytes of RAM, 32 gigabytes of storage, and then they've also had a 4 gigabyte of RAM and 64 gigs of storage model. So Motorola's got the best bang for your buck, and as of this moment, the G5 Plus is available for, or the G5 is available for about 175 to 200 depending on where you get it, and the G5 Plus is available between 250 and 300. So for what you're getting, I mean, you're getting a Snapdragon 600 processor or 600 series processor. You're getting, like I said, either 2 or 4 gigs of RAM, 32 or 64 gigs of storage, and you're getting a micro SD card slot with the Moto G series. The only difference between the Moto G series and the Moto Z series is the mods. Motorola's got a modular system with their Z line of phones where you can add a battery. That kind of takes care of some people's complaints about not having removable batteries. Now they've got modular removable battery packs, but those aren't cheap either, which is why I haven't bought one. I haven't bought a Moto Z line phone or a mod, because most mods are between 80 and 2 or 300 bucks. So I mean, you're really buying into that closed ecosystem of mods and just hoping after 3 years of support that they'll still support those mods for you, but there's no guarantee, which is why I'm not spending all that money for, let's say, 3 years of modular compatibility, and then they're pretty much useless unless I keep the device for years to come. So there's a bunch of different options. There's a bunch of different configurations. The RAM does matter, and the storage does matter, because Android usually takes up between 9 and 12 gigabytes of storage right off the bat. So a 16 gigabyte memory phone or storage phone really only has 9 or 8 or 9 gigs of available memory. And then the 32 gigabytes of storage, there's usually between 20 and 22 gigabytes available. And also, you want to keep an eye on, if you're buying like an HTC or LG or Samsung device, you got to keep an eye on the RAM, because stock Android, you can get away with 2 gigabytes of RAM, whereas the Nexus 5 and 5X had 2 gigabytes of RAM, and you had about, I think, a gig or 700 or 800 megabytes of RAM left. So, once you load up the phone, the operating system's going to load itself into memory. I mean, people have argued with me in the past about, RAM doesn't work that way on Android, but I will find and link a video to Android Authority. Does a great job of explaining how Android and iOS both handle RAM or random access memory. I'm going to go into more detail about these also, but long story short, it doesn't matter how the software is configured to use RAM. You cannot take away from the inherent function of RAM. Just saying that there's stuff that doesn't use RAM. I mean, you can look on any website you want. It's going to tell you random access memory is where you load an app up on your phone and it's going to load it into memory. If if you load a 300 megabyte game into memory, it's going to use between 1 and 300 megabytes of RAM, depending on how the game is set up and all that. But you can't take away from the inherent function of a component just because the operating system is designed to handle it just a little differently. So take that for what you will. That's just my voice on it, but I will go ahead and link a video to that, as well as link the Qualcomm page that I use to produce this video with, and that way you guys can look it up for yourself and see what the difference is specifically between. It goes into great detail too. It talks about uplink, downlink, or LTE, uplink, downlink, carrier aggregation, download speed max, upload speed max, camera compatibilities, quick charge, video. I just lost my word, but the video format or video codec, CPU clock speeds, GPU, what kind of graphical processing units in it, and all that. So you can look into that detailed for yourself if you would like, but I'm going to go ahead and leave both of those links down in the comments section down below, so hopefully it's easier for you guys to click on and find and view for yourself. So I hope this video was informative for you guys. Like I said, I'll go into more detail about these different things in different videos, but this is just a very brief overview of how different Android phones work with different configurations of components. So hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. Helps the channel out, helps me out, helps get me motivated to make more videos like this for you guys. So share with anybody who's interested in learning a little bit of how Android works and how Android phones are designed with different components. And of course, subscribe for more content like this. Till next time, this was Dusty with Blind-Droid Tech. I'll see you in the next one.